Hello, welcome to the France 24 interview. Well, you've probably seen the terrible images. Children with swollen bellies and a vacant gaze, their ribs protruding under arms as thin as matchsticks. East Africa's worst drought in 60 years has left millions on the brink of starvation. And the United Nations says that the worst-hit area spans 2 war-ravaged zones in southern Somalia. Now there, the crisis has moved officially beyond just a food emergency to a full-blown famine. And we're hearing warnings now of worse to come. Well, my guest today is joining us from Rome, Cristina Amaral. Thanks for being here. You are with the Food and Good morning. You're with the Food and Agriculture Organization, and you're sort of the chief of emergency operations. I would like to ask you something. Your organization sort of describes itself as leading the efforts globally to fight and even defeat hunger. And yet here we are once again in a situation where we're seeing a widespread African food emergency with famine in some areas, and it seems like we are behind the curve once again. Why are we always playing catch up here?
Well, certainly there's a need for also some long-term investments, and also there is a need to do things differently when we do emergency responses. We cannot just limit ourselves to cushion the immediate needs. When we do it, we need to look at saving lives and saving livelihoods. And what we have been advocating, and is in the way we approach the emergency response, we should start to think immediately how to help people to get back on their feet, how to help them to start to produce, to get their own means of survival reestablished, and to help them through the crisis to be able to be less dependent on aid. And this type of approach, sometimes it's very difficult to impose from the beginning, because there's always a pressure to act, and certainly we cannot just look at crisis of food security when things come mediatic. We have to think about also building resilience, because these types of shocks are there to stay. And what is really not acceptable, and I even say it's immoral, that a drought will become a famine, when today we have all the technical means that will go through it and avoid the worst. So our advocacy is to start immediately to help people to keep their animals, to be able to plant their crops in October. So by the end of the year, hopefully they will be able to get their own food and be less dependent. At the same time, if we help people today, as we are doing in South Somalia, through cash for work, rehabilitation of public works, some cash transfers to the most vulnerable families, and then some social and economic project. Because at the end of the day, it's getting people together with the project.
At the end of the day, but we are still speaking medium and long term. What I don't quite understand is, someone from the World Food Program was telling me here on the same set recently that you've seen this coming for 18 months, even 2 years out. So why wasn't there enough time to even prepare? That's surely enough time for 1 or 2 harvests.
There was certainly enough time to prepare. We have been running a preparedness project for the Horn of Africa for the last 2 years, since the drought in 2008, but there was no substantive response to scale up some of these preparedness activities. It's a kind of activity that falls between the cracks of humanitarians and those of the long-term development, that sometimes don't consider crisis prevention at the heart of the policies and the long-term development plans. We have launched more than 5 alerts since last year, saying things are getting worse. I was myself in the region in March, talking with the governments, talking with the donors in the region at the technical level, telling them there is a drought, it's going to get worse, we need to scale up our efforts, but unfortunately we haven't done collectively enough.
So it takes, it seems...
We didn't have the means to do more in time.
And in other words, the way you get the means, it seems, is you have to repeatedly alarm people, and the way to do that is to say there's a famine.
Well, we don't say that there is a famine in a light way. We have today a scientific methodology substantiated by field assessments, that allow us to say that there are more than 2 people per 10,000 inhabitants, that the malnutrition are high. So this is a whole process, but we should be able to work faster when there is a food security crisis before it becomes a famine.
Christina
that,
Amaral,
lack of...
I'm sorry.
Yes?
I'm sorry to cut in, but I'm curious about the question of famine. It seems. Can you argue there's a political aspect to declaring a famine? Because there are areas, perhaps, say in Ethiopia, right on the border with Somalia, where the situations are just as bad, and some aid workers would argue that there's actually famine there, but there's no declaration of famine.
Well, we need to ask the government of Ethiopia to be able to probably get a more in-depth nutrition and food security assessment so that we have the data that will allow us to say that there is a famine. But we have been saying that the food security situation is an emergency in South Somalia, and that should be enough to scale up the aid. We don't need, and I think that is really what is the wrong signal, is that when a famine is declared, it means it's already too late. We have a lot more of mortality, and this should be really unacceptable. We have to look at emergencies in a different way. We have to look at sustaining the livelihoods of farmers, because they have been living in these areas for millenniums, and they have survived in this harsh climate. So why can't we make it better today?
I understand that, but you were mentioning the Ethiopia government now enabling you to be able to get that reliable data. They have to be willing to cooperate. Have you been able to collect data in areas of Ethiopia, say the Ogaden region, right on the border with Somalia? Do you have reliable data, and what does that data show you?
We have been present in South Ethiopia, but the assessments, the food security, some of these assessments are done by the structures of the government of Ethiopia. Let's not forget that the first responsibility to support food security in a country is with the government of the country.
The government of Ethiopia?
The government of Ethiopia will certainly be doing what they have to do to avoid that the situation in their country will deteriorate.
Ms. Amaral, but let me ask you, we're talking about in Somalia, the difficulty of getting the aid through is with the Muslim insurgency, the Shabab. It seems you're also having difficulty with the government of Ethiopia trying to get aid through there, or at least an acknowledgement that there's a problem.
We have been working with the government of Ethiopia to start to track water, animal feed, to look at support of the communities, and we have been working on cash for work in those areas of South Ethiopia. So there is certainly a better access to South Ethiopia. And let's not forget that the government of Ethiopia has its own structures, have structures of the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Livestock, and is doing and is following its own responsibilities to support its own people. Ethiopia has one of the largest safety net programs in the world that is targeting 7 million people, and this is certainly one of the programs that has helped to cushion some of the damage of the poor season this year.
Getting some.
So I would not feel confident that to say that there is a famine in Ethiopia. I think that there was early action there that prevented the worst. But certainly there is much, much more that is needed to be done, because we still have 2 or 3 months of a dry period and a very, very dry and hot period ahead, and that is critical to avoid that things will be worse.
Finally, though, at the end of the day, you can only really get aid to people in governments and in countries that are willing to cooperate. If they're not willing to cooperate, you have a pretty big problem.
Well, the governments of the region, I think, are very much aware of the seriousness, and we are seeing really a step up of aid needs. And you also have to see that there are decentralized structures at the state level that have been very active in responding. So we will count on the own structures of the country, and the humanitarian aid should really complement the government efforts. Because in the end, I say, problems of the countries are in the first line of duty of their own governments, and that's why the governments are elected and they have to respond and are accounting to their own people. So we have to be there to support those efforts. We don't see at the moment that there is an institutional failure in those countries that would need to call for, let's say, for international attention to that. I believe that the governments are responsible.
So very briefly, you are confident that as of now, there is really famine, as you define it, only in those two regions of southern Somalia where it's been officially declared. There is not famine, as you define it, anywhere else in East Africa right now.
We don't have evidence. We don't have evidence to mention that there is a declared famine in other regions. But we have made it very, very clear that the situation is moving by the day. And we are in the middle of the dry period. We had a poor harvest. So it does mean that when we get in and do our next assessment now in August, that if nothing is done before now and mid of August, that we'll not find the situation worse. We have been alerting. Things are getting worse, but we can only declare responsibly a famine when we have the evidence of the surveys that are telling us that these indicators have been surpassed, that we have surpassed a certain threshold that becomes really
that becomes critical.
But it should not be. But it should not be the reason not to act. Even a food security emergency should be enough to step up the actions.
Christina
because what we want is that.
I'm sorry, we are going to have to leave it there, but I appreciate it. And I think you've conveyed the sense there. You can't wait till the last minute to act. You are monitoring the situation carefully. But I also get the sense, you've been talking to us today for the Food and Agriculture Organization about emergency operations in Africa. I get the sense you also need to have the governments on your side and cooperating. We appreciate you being our guest here today on Florence Van Katzler, talking about the food crisis in the Horn of Africa. And thanks to all of you for watching the Florence Van Katzler interview.